Oh my goodness, how do I turn this music off? Well, that was fun, wasn't it, Susan?
It got me moving. Yes.
I know. All right, well, we're live and super excited for our first episode of Diverse Voices. Diverse Voices is dedicated to sharing leadership opportunities with viewers who embrace a growth mindset by seeing the world as full of opportunities instead of obstacles. I think this is going to be great. Our first special wonderful guest today is Susan M. Susan is a certified professional diversity coach and strategic business advisor who focuses on building more inclusive workplaces through coaching and mentoring. She's a business leader who puts people first. One of the main reasons that Susan is here is while at Macy's, she helped launch the employer resource groups and was sponsor for the Asian American ERG for 9 years. Susan strives to build inclusive climates where everyone can contribute and realize their full potential. She actually earned her diversity and inclusion certificate from Cornell and is a certified professional diversity coach. Susan, hi, and welcome to us for this great little lunch break for so many people. How are you today?
I'm great. And I'm so glad to be here, Michael. Thank you so much for including me.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for this. B+ERGs are such a big part of organizations. It's really interesting for those who may not know, employee resource groups exist at about 90% of Fortune 500 companies, really started launching in about the 80s and have become so critical for business. It's important to understand their impact, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today. And whether you are a leader, a sponsor, or a member, or just curious about ERGs, this will be a great conversation. So Susan, I would love to hear a little bit about your background. How did you even get started in your DEI work?
Yeah, I got started back in 2011 when I was invited to join the diversity committee at Macy's. At the time, my boss was leading that up, and I was so excited to be a part of it because when I really think about it, diversity and inclusion has always been top of mind for me. Yeah, maybe I didn't have the language at the time, but being a first generation immigrant and sort of navigating through all kinds of different spaces where I was one of a few or one of the only, I always knew that there was this, and maybe at the time it was really the lack of diversity was what was very obvious to me, but always wanting to belong and really trying to figure out how I can be a part of whatever community I was a part of. So I was really excited about being a part of the diversity committee and also being charged to introduce employee resource groups at Macy's Merchandising Group, which I think was probably, some of the most fulfilling work that I've done there.
That's super exciting. I'm thrilled to hear a little bit about your journey. So having been there at the beginning when they first launched, how have you seen ERGs evolve in the last 10 years?
Wow. When I think about the trajectory of the ERGs, I mean, it's really been, such an incredible thing to see. I think in the beginning, it was really about social networks, creating a community of like-minded folks and people who shared similar experiences. We focused a lot on cultural awareness and really being able to put on some events where we had some, cultural awareness, education, a lot of it revolving around food, and that's sort of where we started. And then I think as we started to have conversations amongst ourselves, it really became clear, like, hey, we all know this, it can't just be us talking, to ourselves about this. So then really being able to reach out and to be able to broaden the network and broaden allies and really be able to collaborate, I think brought about some of the more impactful changes. But I've seen ERGs go from social networks to be able to make policy changes within the company, really, working through what does flex work look like? How do we make sure that we have paternity leave, we have paternal leave as well as maternal leave? So things like that. So there were definitely policy issues that we were able to impact, and then really business initiatives. How do we become a trusted resource in the company to all different aspects of it? So we went from really social networks to business partners. And I think that that's really, been the biggest change that I've seen in the last 10 years. And then, of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, really figuring out, how do we create brave spaces so that we're able to have really very deep conversations about what it means to be, in America today, and what are some of the work that is still out there that needs to be done for it to be equitable for all. And I think that we've been leading a lot of those conversations. So it's really become very, culturally important, I think, for the ERGs to be a part of those conversations. And I think in a lot of places, they're leading those conversations and really leading into the discomfort just to make sure that, we're bringing awareness to all of that.
Well, you brought up some great examples of that evolution, and when you started to have opportunities for influence on the way in which the business engages the employees, brought forth additional benefits that bond those employees to the company, that lets them see and understand they're not just a number, they're not just a seat at the seat, but they are actually an individual and are providing value and seeing every employee as a whole person. Are there any outstanding initiatives that you are most proud of? You're like, this was such a big win that we did not expect to win, that really sort of changed the business and the way in which ERGs were seen a little bit differently at Macy's?
Yeah, I think a lot of it were some of the more business-led initiatives. So back in 2015, when we launched Talia Sodi, which was a brand that we went after to go to really enter the Latinx market, and really being able to leverage the power of our La Voz ERG at the time, and to be able to leverage them as focus groups to really understand not just the design, but really we really went from design to fit to materials to marketing to really sort of messaging. So, it was a whole, 360 of really figuring out how we can best launch this brand across multiple categories. And they were a huge part of that. So I think that opened our eyes really to really kind of saying, what, we're a huge company. And at the time, we had 130,000 employees. So when you think about the power of that, of the people that you've got in your organization that you can really leverage on any topic to be able to really utilize as a trusted resource, I think that made a huge difference in terms of how people looked at ERGs. And then I would say, the next part of it was really, we did a collaboration. The Asian American ERG and La Voz got together to do a panel called Real Talk. And it was just about our experiences in the workplace. And one of the things that was great about that conversation was that you kind of see that there are similarities across multiple groups. And it's not just, it's not just specific to your own. So that was another great way to be able to leverage some of the issues and really be able to multiply some of the impact of what that is. That, I think, really led to then what we sort of started as a Can We Talk series, which really was about more, it was more difficult conversations around race and around, around policing and around what was happening in the Black community, et cetera. So I think each event and each sort of benchmark really helps you get to the next one. So I think it's really helped us to really ease into the discomfort of it, little by little. And I think that's really showed the organization how you can tap into this resource to be able to start some of those conversations in a very safe way, but that could really reverberate across the organization.
I love that. I love that you started the narrative and started sharing the story of that the employees themselves were in essence a reflection of the consumers, right? They understood what those consumers may want because of their own diversity, even amongst the Latinx market. They could showcase the different avenues that the company could take. And then as you start talking about that collaboration, I'm really curious, what does collaboration start to look like? Like, how important is collaboration between those B+ERGs? And maybe for our audience, you could talk a little bit about maybe one small step that an ERG can take today, and maybe one of those big steps, even if it's reflecting on some of the pieces you've done yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think, when we really think about each of us as individuals, I mean, we've got to think about the intersectionality, right? I mean, so, I'm Korean American, I'm also a woman, I'm also a mom. So when you kind of think about all the different layers that each of us bring to it, it's clear that, that sometimes there isn't going to be just the one group that's going to really speak to me or resonate with me on all those different levels. So I think by being able to collaborate, we're really able to show people that we understand that they're not just, one visible slice of diversity, or there might be other things there that maybe we don't see so clearly, but that's there. So I think the first thing is really making sure that within your team. So I was the sponsor for the Asian American ERG, but I had people on my team that led different ones. So always being able to keep some of those conversations going and really kind of talking with amongst yourselves and saying, hey, how was your last event? How did that go? Oh, you know what? My turnout wasn't great. Why do you think that is? Or, I noticed you guys, did that event on a Thursday at noon, was that a better time than maybe trying to do something in the afternoon, et cetera? So some of those casual conversations, I think, are a great place to start, but then also providing some sort of formal get together for the B+ERG leads to be able to get in a room together and really talk about best practices, what's working, what's not working, I think is another great way to do that. But wherever you can have some of those conversations off the cuff, a lot of my counterparts were also sponsors for their respective ERGs. So a lot of our social networking also touched on that as well. So tell me what's going on with that, or tell me what happened, with your group, or was there any wins from the last quarter that we should be talking about, et cetera. So I think some of it is very casual conversation, and then really trying to push for some more formal guardrails as well, so that you've got some of that consistent conversation that's happening amongst them.
I love that you're building trust amongst the ERGs, both through the casual conversations and relationships. It's those moments in between the meetings and between the sessions, sharing knowledge, running into someone at the water cooler. That's going to be really challenging, I think, going forward. So where you can build those networks are certainly ways to ensure that you're really focused on building bridges. And obviously that'll set you up for those little moments to really launch into those bigger moments and those bigger movements as you start to leverage up those relationships. But I think the challenge with a lot of relationships is some people are very actively involved. They're active participants. And then there are those, maybe they're introverted, or they're just a little shy, or they don't know that they really have a seat at the table. And there is that concern, I think, for many, especially with B+ERGs and intersectionality, to think about ensuring that no one is left out of the conversation. How do you as a leader try to invite people in, or encourage those B+ERGs to invite others in, to make sure that there's equal representation?
Yeah, I think we have to be really deliberate in making sure that we're communicating the fact that all the groups are open to everyone, and that we welcome everyone, and that we want allies, and we want to make sure that it's not just an echo chamber of like-minded, or people who are just from the same country or origin or anything like that. So I think that's one big part of it. And then I think as leaders, we have to include that conversation into our staff meetings, and we have to bring it back to the business just on a regular, whether it's our weekly meetings, or maybe it's my roundtable with my associates or my assistants, et cetera, and really being able to talk about the power of being a part of something like the employee resource group. What's the benefit to you? What's the benefit to me? What's the benefit to the organization? What are some of the things that you can expect? How do you get visibility across different leaders in the company? And I think that's one of those things that we don't talk about enough. When you're part of a big organization that has 100,000 or more people, so much of getting ahead is just being noticed, and just having that opportunity to have face-to-face time with a senior leader. So what better place to do that than at an event or at an B+ERG meeting or something like that, where you've got a sponsor who you may never see in a regular business setting. So I think that there's plenty of opportunities like that to be able to do that, but I do think it does rest on people leaders to really be able to talk about the value of being a part of something like that, in terms of a B+ERG. And then also for the sponsors, the leaders, the members, I mean, we're all responsible to then talk about it, tell others, invite people. So I think that that's really, it has to be deliberate conversations that we're having. The communication has to be deliberate.
Well, and in being deliberate, that is really encouraging leaders to show up, to ensure that, and I think if I caught this, you're encouraging them to share and draw others out, but probably also maybe share their stories. But if they're drawing others out and having those momentary conversations and those little sidebars, they're going to learn about their teammates, their teams in different ways, especially with some of that interesting exposure. We talked a little bit about people hesitating, maybe. Storytelling can be really personal, and people sometimes aren't very encouraged to share their stories. I think we're seeing a lot more of that in the last year. Do you have any tips or tricks to really encourage storytelling?
Yeah, I think for me, it's always been about, going first. And I think that if you can show that you're vulnerable and you can share some of your story, and I'm not saying share everything, the good, bad, and the ugly, you share what you're comfortable with, of course, as long as you've got some of that trust developed within your team. But I think we have to model that behavior and we have to go first. And the more that we are able to do that, I think that encourages others to do the same. And then I think we have to, set the right environment for that, really be able to create a safe space. So whether that's at a smaller roundtable or that's at my weekly meeting with just my immediate team, and we talk about the fact that, this is a safe space, this is confidential, etc. And we can kind of go around the room and talk about how we're feeling. Some of the things that we would sometimes do, which I think was a great, step towards some of this, is really when a new person comes into our team, we ask them, give us a fun fact about you. Like, what should we know? So that starts to really, really get us to think about each other as whole people, not just, our job titles. So I think, that encourages some of the sharing, but I think that, again, as people leaders, we have the responsibility to go first and to be able to be vulnerable and share.
Yeah, and story sharing, I start thinking about not only personal and lived experiences, but also how that intersectionally shows up. Like I try to show up in my community as not only a gay white man, but also recognizing that my marriage matters a lot to me. The way I show up as an uncle, there's a bit of intersectionality. Sometimes intersectionality is a struggle, but can also be just the better parts of yourself. Where are you as an individual? Where are you as a contributor showing up in your community? Which makes me really think about the opportunities for B+ERGs to connect with those communities in stronger and more apparent ways. I think that a lot of ERGs, especially since we're still in a pandemic and there's still a lot of people who are home or cautious about going out and being engaged in their communities, are still curious about how they can really interact with those communities and connect with those communities. Do you have any thoughts about how we could help guide others to be engaged within their local communities?
Yeah, I think it's important to, see what community outreach programs are out there that's available to you, and then really align it back to some of the things that you're passionate about as a group. So, if hunger is something that's really important to you, if it's about mentorship, if it's about giving back to a homeless facility, et cetera. So it sort of depends, because I think you have to be able to align it back to your charter, because in that way it will be meaningful to you, and then really figure out how you can help. And I think that there's so many things that we can do virtually now, whether it's mentorship. And for me, I always go back to mentorship, because I think, to me, that is really one of my passions, is really figuring out how we can help the next generation really, enter the workplace more prepared to be able to navigate it than maybe, than I did when I was that age. So I think that's really important. And then really being able to give them some of the language and the expectations around diversity and inclusion, which I think would help them navigate the space a little bit better as well. So whether that means, being involved with an organization like NAP, which is the National Association for Asian American Professionals, or Big Brothers and Big Sisters, or APIA Scholars, there's a million of them that do have mentoring programs that we can all be a part of. I think it is one way to do that. And then I know for us, we always supported Henry Street Settlement, every year, because they got these early learning programs, and their clientele happens to be very diverse, lots of Asian Americans, but also lots of African Americans as well as Latinx. So a community center like that is somebody that we as B+ERGs can collaborate and really be able to show up together as one, which I think makes a much bigger impact into the community. Because I think that's what you'll find, that even when you're working with different organizations and mentoring, they'll say to you, well, you know what, some of our, 20%, I'm making it up, but X% of our clients happen to be, African American or happen to be Latinx, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of organizations like that that could use multiple ERGs to be able to partner with, and that would really multiply the impact that the organization can have.
I really appreciate that, because if I look at the younger generations, they're experiencing a greater degree of diversity than older generations would or should. I don't think that diminishes the perspective of those who are older, who have come before, but it certainly gives an opportunity to guide with some best practices, but also hear those stories as you're engaging in a conversation. When you're looking at the next generation of employees, is there something that's, I guess, surprising you about their perspective, about their own personal experiences, and how do you guide them, even if it ends up being a moment of reverse mentorship by learning from those conversations?
Yeah, I have to say that most of my mentoring relationships have been a combination of reverse mentoring as well, because they definitely do see the world so differently. And I think that for those of us, I'm a Gen Xer, and then my kids are Gen Z, and we're all going to be working at the same time, which is wild. You would never even think that. And I think that our expectations are so different. And I think, we grew up thinking we had to compartmentalize work, home, we had all these different boxes that we were trying to manage. And I think that the next generation is really coming in and saying, you know what, this is me, and this is all kind of part of me, whether it's work, not work, et cetera. So I think it's a very important conversation to have, and to really even, I personally think that the next generation is going to really push us to get there faster. So I welcome them coming into the workplace, because I think that they're really going to be a driving force in continuing to move this movement forward. So I definitely welcome that. But I think it's going to cause some of us to be uncomfortable and to have to really think differently, and just to be able to be more flexible in terms of how we think about the organization, how we think about the culture, how we think about the workplace. I think we're going to be challenged, but I think it's a good challenge.
Oh, yeah. As you talk about being a Gen Xer and being challenged, it makes me sort of flash back to, and there may be others in the audience who can remember this moment, when I used to watch The Real World, and when Pedro first showed up on The Real World as a Latinx man who diagnosed HIV positive. That was one of the first pivotal moments where people started to expose themselves. And I think at the time, a more Caucasian audience was maybe not only surprised, but it became a bridge in, because certainly Real World started to show us a degree of diversity that many Americans hadn't seen 20 or 30 years before. And now flash forward 30 years later, there's this intersectionality that exists with these students. They expect so much, and young adults expect so much of us. I think that sometimes there's that moment of not only giving them the grace that they are pushing us, but also asking of them the grace to maybe give us a little forgiveness, because we're in an uncomfortable situation as well. Yeah. There's so much I think that we can learn from them. And I'm really hopeful for where they're pushing us right now. There's been so much acceleration in the last 18 months. I think it's delightfully shocking.
Yeah, for sure. And I was just reading an article the other day, and I think it was Penn State, if I'm not mistaken, but they're changing freshman to first class, because they to first year, because they're really very sensitive about the language, of making sure that it's gender neutral, et cetera. So when you think about some of that, I think it's happening so fast right now, or it seems that way anyway. So I think that by having this next generation in the workplace, I think it's really going to require a lot of us to flex, maybe even more than we're ready to. But I think it's a welcome change.
Well, yeah, I don't want to sound like that old man. I'm middle-aged, but change is happening constantly. If you think about the
Yes.
language we had when we were
Yeah.
growing up and where it has evolved, whether that is the common vernacular or the fact that people are using pronouns, students
Hmm.
are using them, and that's just their natural language.
Hmm.
We have a role to play in that. That we need to show them that we're including them by respecting their traditions as much as we're asking them to respect our own traditions.
Yeah.
Uh, I was hoping we could do a little bit of a lightning round,
Uh-oh.
maybe some quick questions that I think I'm curious about your instinct on some of these because one of my thoughts is we can all tackle bigger issues through really small steps. Sometimes it seems like we're climbing a mountain, that you're standing at the base of the hill, and to achieve something so far and that will take so long can be really intimidating.
Hmm.
So, what about a quick win? What is one small thing our audience can take today to make themselves a better ally?
Yeah. I think it's about listening. And I know
Mm,
that that's a big lesson for me as well. I did an assessment the other day where it was like, do you talk more or do you listen more? And I'm thinking, oh, I'd like to think I listen more. But I think that for most of us, we can do a better job of that. Just really hearing somebody out and really being mindful about, what you're hearing and really focusing on that person. So I think listening is something that is a quick win. And I do think for me, the whole idea of sharing stories where you can really personalize the experience and you can really see the
mm.
person as opposed to the issue or I think that is what changes minds and hearts. And so the more that we can communicate, I think, we can definitely make strides.
Oh yeah, there's so much power in either asking a good question or
Mm-hmm.
and giving people the space to answer, or just letting them speak and letting them share and paying attention to what's being shared with you,
Yes.
because it may impact you and may evolve you as well. There's been so many stories that have been shared. I think for the last year, is there one learning that you have from the last year? Like, what did you learn from looking back?
Wow. I definitely learned that I wasn't as intentional as I wanted to be.
Hmm.
Just, with life, day to day work, all of it. And I think that, I'm calling it a pause. It wasn't really a pause because obviously we went through a lot in the last 14, 15 months. But I think it's really brought me back to this idea of purpose and it's made me think more as a beginner almost in it, just really kind of thinking about what is my purpose and what do I want my impact to be? And I think that for a long time it was just, autopilot and it was just
Mhm.
really sort of, between the day to day and, the soccer trips and et cetera. I mean, you're so busy all the time. But I think that was really the biggest learning, just knowing that I wasn't as deliberate or intentional as I want to be. So that's what I strive to be, even as we inch out of this.
Yeah, there's something I'm taking away from your language of being deliberate, which is in essence living a purpose-driven life, which
Mhm.
I realize a lot of people and companies have been called to the table in the last 2 years, if not the last 20 years, as I was working in corporate social responsibility. There's this expectation that business and actually individuals themselves are not just about making money. Sure, there's
Yep.
something in its own way interesting about work, and it certainly allows us to feed our passions. But when you tie those two elements together, there's so much amplification and so much that can be gained.
Yeah.
So you're a professional, and obviously you're reflecting on your goal of being a bit more deliberate. Is there maybe a different piece of professional advice you have for our audience?
Different piece. Well, okay. I've definitely learned this as well throughout this past experience in the last 15 months is really broaden your network.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to reach out to people you don't know and don't be afraid to broaden your circle to people who maybe, are not close to you. And I think that is, I've always thought of myself as a decent networker. I've got, over 500 connections on LinkedIn. I mean, that's the way it's supposed to be. But when you really, delve into it, then you realize, oh, 60% of them work in my company.
Mhm.
What kind of broad network is that? So really being able to reach out and connect with people. I have to say some of the most meaningful conversations I've had in the last year were people that I've never met before. And whether they were fellow coaches or people also transitioning into a different career, et cetera, I mean, we were able to connect on different levels that I didn't have, within my network to be able to draw from. So I would say, look at your network and try to expand, just really think more broadly about what that looks like, and just meet different people. Don't be afraid to meet others, because I think that's where it starts. I mean, the more interaction you have with people who are different from you, it is what's going to make the difference.
Oh, certainly. And I think it's not only about broadening your network, but when you think of how those people may be different from you, there's still some degree of intersectionality. What you started to share was people outside of my own company, other coaches. So there's still a common bond that sets the foundation for learning and understanding somebody else and helps you grow along with helping them grow. So my last question is, if you could solve one problem, what would it be? Any problem you see out in the world?
One problem, just one.
Just one.
Well, I guess we've got to solve for the hunger problem. I think just, across the world, I think that to me, just, it seems absurd that that's something that we still talk about, and not only across the world, but across this country. And when you kind of think about all the people that were impacted, with the pandemic and with the food insecurity that's out there, I think that really, the inequity in this country, I think is something that we definitely saw loud and clear, and we've got to figure out how to solve that. So that's a big one. But yes, I would say that.
Oh, most definitely. And there's too many hungry people in our world.
Yeah.
I want to circle back. I had an interesting question that came through. I sort of missed it. I'll put it up on the screen. So this gentleman, Dave Dossick, has asked, what actionable advice can you share that may enable employees for remote to share their experiences and needs for support to be more successful? So if they're looking for a more permanent remote setting, what can they do to share their experiences and share their stories? That's a great question, Dave. I start to wonder if it's merely getting out there and being public. I think about your comment, Susan, of leveraging your network, but also growing your network, being transparent with those moments of vulnerability. And if you start to create a close bond with someone who you don't really know, getting on the phone with them for 15 minutes just to create a deeper connection will allow you, I think, to build those bridges. Susan, maybe you have a perspective on this as well?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, one of the things that we've seen with remote work is that, all the meetings on the calendar are back to back, back to back, back to back, and they're so transactional. And there is really no pause or no opportunity just to be able to, chit chat or get to know people on a personal level. So I think wherever you can pick up the phone or just FaceTime, just off Teams or off Zoom, something that's a little bit more, casual or not professional in a way, I think helps. And I think the more that you can connect with people, whether it's, what's going on in your life, what's going on, how was your weekend? What do you think about the mask mandate? Did you get vaccinated? How are you feeling? It knocked me out the other day, or whatever it is. I think that there's so many different conversations to have. And I think that so many of us are dealing with the same uncertainties, and to be able to talk about that in a more human level, as opposed to within a work environment and just, the debate between 3 days a week or 4 days a week. There's just so much more there. So I think being able to pick up the phone and do that is really critical.
I think that's a great way of inviting people in, by picking up the phone. I also recognize that for introverts, that may be a struggle. I mean, I often encourage companies to look at it a different way and actually set up, in essence, like a networking hour, some opportunity to ripple out your relationships and have a conversation for an hour, mix and match, where it isn't about work. It's talking about those fun things of, like, what's your most important experience? What's something that shaped you as a person? Because sharing those, even if it's in a 15-minute conversation, can really allow you to build a relationship and actually share something of yourself and add some dimensionality that's outside of work. So I am thrilled. I mean, great point, Susan. I'm thrilled that David asked that question. Susan, you've been amazing. I really want to thank you for kicking us off this first week. It's so exciting to have you. I think, as we're moving out from ERGs, I start thinking about, there's this moment we're in right now. through AAPI. We're going to be bridging into next month. We're stepping into Pride. There's obviously opportunities for intersectionality there, but actually opportunities for intersectionality throughout the entire year. So Susan, thank you so much for joining me today. So it seems like for next week, we've already got our next guest aligned. Susan, you may know this person because you attended Cornell courses. We're going to have Dave Siliberto, a senior human resource executive who actually runs the D&I course at Cornell as a professor there. So we're going to use that to kick off Pride and talk about how do you as a company make Pride Month a meaningful experience. But I think that, Susan, there's so much we can carry forward from your conversations around ERG, leverage that into Pride, and actually do that 365 days a year. So Susan, thanks to you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Truly, truly a pleasure. Thanks to everyone who is able to join us today.
Thank you, Susan, everyone.
We'll wish you well. And all right, everybody, we'll be seeing you on the other side, 12:15 every Wednesday. Be well. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.